Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you are watching me from. This is Shem Kalafa for Shem Speaks on YouTube, Shem K_Sai on TikTok, Shem Kalafa on Rumble, and Shem Kalafa on Facebook. Welcome back to my channels from wherever you will be watching me from. I took a bit of a break because there are various other trainings that I was facilitating at the time that needed my attention, basically just around psychological issues that different individuals are facing. And at the time I was conducting trainings for school-going children, and at the same time I did a training for an organization that had asked for my services last year, basically around mental health in the workplace. And this time I had an opportunity to deal with health, social and emotional well-being from the same organization. Yeah, and truly honored that I was asked to do it again, to do this kind of training again with them. And that's why I have not been able to be online as much as possible or as consistently as possible. I mentioned that I was with some school-going children, as well as some teens and some youth in different environments. One of the places is actually about an hour and a half away from here, in a place called Thika. The other place is in a county called Kitui here in Kenya. So just in case you want to know more about Kitui, you can be able to look it up. The specific region that you are from, you can be able to look it up, see how that place is, see what they are doing, see what they are up to. Kitui is basically a very more or less semi-arid area. I was just having a conversation with some of the locals there, and they were telling me that crops don't really do very well there. So mostly are focused on small-scale agribusiness. If at all they decide to plant anything, they go for wheat, millet, sorghum, anything that will do well within that arid area, and anything that will not necessarily need a lot of water. Yeah, so those are some of the experiences that I've had from around mid to late November preparing for these trainings, and that's why I was not able to join in or to continue with the sessions that we had begun, particularly on the very recent podcast on children and investment, and focusing on the stages of development. So by and by, I am really grateful to be back, and I truly know that some of you are anxious when I will be returning. We truly appreciate and thank God that I've been able to be back, because this platform is indeed by His ability and by His mercy that I am able to do it. I think we'll just get right to it. Last time we were looking at the stages of development as an introduction, trying to see that indeed children are an investment, and anything that we do with them or anything that we do for them directly affects their worldview. It directly has an influence on how they will interact in the world and how they will interpret various other interactions that they are in touch with as they engage in the world. And because of that, it now begins to form certain thoughts, certain perceptions. They begin to look at the world based on the information that they receive from the world. And one of the things that I also mentioned is that the primary source of information of the child is actually the parent in the home. Be sure that whenever you are doing something or whenever you are engaging in a particular thing, the child will see exactly what you are doing, and it will form as part of their memory and their understanding of how things ought to be done. Based on that, once they grow up and once they develop, you see them taking certain traits or certain characteristics from you as a parent. And if the parent was not there, then they will begin to take those characteristics and those habits from other people, because essentially their mind is developing. And because of that, specifically, the mind is not idle. Any information that it receives, it acts on it, it interprets it, it forms as part of its belief system and part of its habits in themselves. And so basically that is why children form a critical part in investing in the future society, because whatever they receive, they adapt to. Whatever they adapt to, it forms part of their way of life. I remember I shared this in one of the podcasts. I think it's in the Depression podcast, and I mentioned it a bit in the Mind, the Levels of Consciousness podcast, where we talked about any thought that is within our minds. Once it stays there, once it is incubated there, once it is processed there, it forms into words. And our words, when we keep repeating certain things that we say for a given period of time, we believe what we say. And when we believe what we say, it translates into actions. Now, the more we repeat certain actions and certain words and certain thoughts, it forms into a cycle called a habit. And when a habit is repeated again and again, that habit forms a character of that person. It continues to cement itself into the character of that person. And character, once it is grounded and once it is repeated again, once it is continually practiced and acted on, by this time it has reached the subconscious mind, or it has reached the subconscious level of the mind. It forms into a lifestyle. And then people will begin saying that this person, this is the way they do their things. It is the same thing that happens with children. Sometimes we think that character formation needs to begin when someone has completed school. But character formation begins when the child has been born. I want to start on something today that reflects on that further. We want to look at it from a pre-birth stage. So what happens before a child is born? And this, in a way, counters the earlier statement that I made. Character is formed once the child is born. When you actually think about it, the character of the child may be formed by their two parents, even before they think about the conception point. And so these two parents, they need to begin to become self-aware. They need to begin to become stable in their own self-awareness, in their understanding of who they are as individuals. Once they gain that stability, then that is what will drive them to desire to have children. And by parents here, I'm basically talking about a man, a biological man, and a biological woman. Once these two are stable in themselves, once they understand themselves, once they are able to create certain patterns amongst themselves that helps them to become mutually beneficial to each other, then and only then will they be ready to start having and raising children. So today we are not just looking at the period of time in which the expectant mother is waiting to give birth to this child. Today we want to focus on both of them. We want to focus on the man and we want to focus on the woman. But specifically we will be trying to look at them in terms of how are they cooperating, how are they working together to gain stability. Initially they worked individually to find their own stability. And once they found their own stability, they then come together to find something that will make them mutually stable. And a very key ingredient of that is actually marriage between both the man and the biological woman. I'm saying biological because they have individually the abilities and the capabilities that are needed to bring forth children. It is not something that can be refuted. It is not something that can be challenged because it is nature. And nature in its own self cannot be challenged. And so because of that, it takes now the understanding of what are their own individual strengths in terms of their biological makeup, And beyond the biological makeup, what are their own individual strengths, psychologically, emotionally, physically, which biology forms part of it? What are their own strengths spiritually, which we look at? And these four are basically the four key dimensions to try and determine the stability of a person. Having said that, I would like us to ask ourselves this question. What kind of world do you, as parents, seek to create for your child? What are the necessary resources at your disposal to create this world? In what ways can you utilize these resources to create the kind of world that your child will be raised up in order to ensure their healthy and normal upbringing by the two of you? What kind of world do you seek to create? And I think before any child comes, that's the first question that both parents need to ask themselves. What kind of world do you aspire to create? And before you answer that question, you need to look at yourselves. What kind of world do you yourself live in? What changes do you want to make, or what adjustments do you want to make in that world? You individually. And as you come together, what kind of world do you want to develop together? So that that world that you are developing together now becomes the landing space for the child that you desire to bring forth for them to be able to develop in the world that you have created for them. And I think as parents, because I believe all of us are, or at some point we will all become parents, those are the questions that we need to begin to ask ourselves. What kind of world do you have? What kind of world do you live in presently? What kind of world do you want to create? When I'm talking about a world, I'm basically talking about the four dimensions of living. And as I stated earlier, it's the psychological dimension, the emotional dimension, the physical dimension, where biophysiological areas are, and at the same time the spiritual dimension. When we're talking about a world, we are looking at it in line with these four dimensions. I would like us to begin to think about that question. What world would you want your child to grow in? What resources do you have at your disposal to ensure that that world that you envision for your child becomes a reality? And how can you use these resources? So what is the world that you want? What are the resources that you need? And in what ways can you use these resources to create that world for that child? Remember, fundamentally, you are the first people to create that world within yourselves. So that when the child comes, the focus does not shift to the child. The focus is bringing that child into that world. And you are living in that world together. I have realized this because I have had these discussions before in different circles, whereby whenever children are born, because children require a lot of attention, they require a lot of care, they are born when they are needy. The attention almost automatically shifts from the parents or the man and his wife to the children. And what that does is that it shifts much of the energies and much of the focus on the needs of the child. And that is naturally understandable. However, remember, if I'm talking to a lady, you woman and your husband, and if I'm talking to a man, you man and your wife, remember that it is the two of you who are building this environment. So sometimes it will be necessary to introduce that child into your environment, into your system of doing things, into the world that you have not just created, but you are continuing to create that world. The creation of that world does not stop when the child is born. The creation of that world continues even after the child is born. There are only adjustments that will need to be made to ensure that the child is incorporated and made a part of that world that you have not only created, but you are continuing to create for them. And not just for them, but you are continuing to create with each other. I like to think of marriage as a partnership. These are two individuals who are gifted differently, who have different strengths, and based on their strengths, they combine their efforts, they combine their resources to build something together and to continue building. Building stops when one or both of them pass away. That is the only time building stops. And that is probably the only time in which one of the parents who is alive at that time, God forbid, one of the parents who is alive at that time now begins to make adjustments based on the absence of their partner. In that case, of course, they will have their partner's memories, they will have their partner's ambitions, they will have their partner's goals and dreams, and they will be trying to see how can they add their partner's goals and dreams concerning their relationship after they have passed on, and instill those goals and dreams and values into the child. And as they do that, it is as if both parents are empowering this child, even if one of them is absent. Death is a very tragic thing, and it is unfortunate that sometimes some children are born into that kind of an environment where one parent is not there, or both of the parents are not there, or they are no longer alive. Because now what that means is that this child is born in an environment of instability. And because they are born needing to depend on the parent, then at that particular time, they have nobody to lean on. They have nobody to rest themselves in order for that person or for those people to raise them and to nurture them. And that's why someone who is orphaned, whether by one or both parents, can really have a hard time emotionally, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. Because of that, they may require the society, as it were, to step in and fulfill those roles in whatever shape or form to ensure that they themselves grow and develop into becoming stable, well-rounded individuals. Be that as it may, when the parents are alive, they will need to ensure that such an environment is created, such a stable environment is created. Because we never know what happens tomorrow. We can only do what needs to be done within today. And so stability for both parents will be very important. First, stability individually, then stability together and sustaining that stability together. And after that, they introduce this child to be part of it. So the parents are not shifting their attention into the world of the child. The parents rather are introducing the child into their world, and at the same time enabling the child to grow and to develop based on their specific age that they will be at, or their specific age category that they will be at. And these are some of the things that we will be discussing in the coming episodes. So be sure to watch out for the coming episodes after this. So once this child is introduced to the parents' world, they become part of it. They form collaborative part of that world, where the parent now begins to respond to the child's needs, and then after that be able again to still fall back to developing the world that they are creating for themselves individually, for themselves as a couple, and for the child. As they do that, the growth and the development now becomes corporate. It is spread out, not just to the parents, but to the child. And the child is able to feel that they are part of these parents' lives. There's nothing as important as that, because what that means is that it grounds in the child's ability to be able to differentiate what is necessary in their environment and what is not necessary in their environment based on the upbringing that they gain. At the same time, they gain the necessary skills, psychologically, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, required to become themselves stable individuals as they leave the home into the outside world. For that reason, it is important to think about children in the long-term perspective. What world are we creating for them? What resources do we have in our disposal? And how are we using these resources so that the child's future is guaranteed? Think of it this way. When we are investing in children, we are not just looking at it in the present or in their lives. We are also looking at it in terms of how will it affect their own children. There's this proverb that says, a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Another version says, a just man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. What is the kind of inheritance that we are looking at? Sometimes people think about it materially. Yes, material inheritance is good and is important. But we also need to look at it in terms of how are these children's inheritance secured psychologically, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, so that they are able to pass that knowledge and they are able to pass those resources to their own children who are coming after them. For that reason, we need to look at several components. I mentioned 4 dimensions that we need to consider when we are thinking about how do we prepare for children before they are born. I mentioned a psychological element, I mentioned an emotional element, I mentioned a physical element, and I also mentioned a spiritual element. I'm going to look at them individually, but very briefly. When you have a moment, we will be able to dive into them in a different podcast, so that even as we look at them individually, we will at least be able to dive much deeper into them in a different podcast. Psychologically basically means how are we preparing ourselves mentally? What are the mental processes that we are creating within ourselves to ensure that we are in the right state of mind? We are in a stable state of mind, which is the right state of mind to prepare prepare for this child. And in that, we basically looked at the components of the mind, which is logic, reason, rationale, and memory. We were able to look at this when we did the introduction of the mind series. Just in case you want to have a recap of that, I will post a link in the description of this video. We were also able to look at the soul in retrospect, because the soul has three components, basically the mind, the will, and the emotions. The mind basically allows us to reason, allows us to think through things critically. It stores information for us. The emotions help us to perceive different connections between different interactions that we have. And the will helps us to make decisions based on the information we have in our minds and the interpretation of the connections that we have with different people and with different items or with different systems. The will helps us to make a decision on that. Psychologically, we are looking at the mental processes. These mental processes, they occur in the reason, in logic, in rationale. Reason is basically the connection between two or more pieces of information. Logic is how each piece of information adds up to an expected end. Rationale is information that you are receiving easily and clearly understood. And memory is basically storage, where all information is stored. And we looked at that in depth in the mind series. So be sure to catch the mind series so that you are able to get into that. We also talked about emotional stability. After psychological stability is emotional stability. And emotional stability is how do we foster productive relationships? When we foster productive relationships, this will lead to social stability and consequently economic stability. Now, sometimes we like putting one before the other. We like putting economic stability before emotional stability. The danger of that is this. When we put economic stability first, we lose out on the social stability that is created when we are fostering social relationships. These social relationships are what help us to add emotional stability that is needed. When you know that you are valid, when you know that you are accepted, when you know that you are loved and appreciated by people because of who you are and because of the value that you bring towards them, it inspires you to connect or to seek emotional connections with them. And as you seek that, it helps you to build stable relationships with them. Think about it also in terms of you and your spouse. When you value them, when they value you back, when they find that you are contributing to their good and to their welfare and to their well-being, they will do the same. And as they do that, what you are actually fostering is emotional stability between the two of you. And that stability will lead to a positive mindset. It will lead to a positive outlook as you approach different responsibilities within the different environments that you are in. And consequently, that will lead to economic stability. Because when you have positive relationships amongst yourself, you are fostering positive emotions amongst yourselves. You are able to radiate that and translate that in how you are creating that world. You are able to also add more value to other people who you relate with. That fosters positive relationships with other people within the community and within the society. And there are higher chances of increasing or raising your economic stability, because one person will lead to connections that you require to engage them in an economic pursuit or endeavor. And what that does is that it builds you stable economically. We mentioned physical stability. Here we are basically looking at the biophysiological processes, and because of biology we may not necessarily get into it, but in summary, men have a different biological system than women simply because of how our bodies are made. At a very cellular level, there are certain components that are similar, there are others that are completely different, especially when you look at the reproductive systems and the hormones that engage in the course of those systems interacting. And now because of that, that's where now both of them, because they are different sexually, then both of them are necessary for the formation of this child, for the conception of this child. When you look at the development of this child in the mother's womb, basically for most human beings on average it takes about 9 months. For healthy and productive couples, it takes about 9 months. For whatever reason, there are some babies that come earlier than others, but even then there are systems that are put in place to ensure that the baby's life or the child's life who is born gains a certain sense of health and a certain sense of well-being, specifically in their physical body, so that once they are strong physically, they begin to gain certain strength strengths and skills in coordination which are acquired over time as this child develops and as they grow. So the physical development, the biophysiological systems and their processes need to be stable enough. We need to understand what their needs are. We need to also understand how they connect with each other, how they communicate with each other, to ensure that the bodies of these two parents are healthy enough to bring forth the child, to both conceive, to take care of each other during that process, and especially in this case for the man to take care of his wife in this case, so that when the child develops, they develop in a healthy relationship. They find a healthy home already prepared for them by their parents. The preparation does not stop there. The preparation continues. Stability is not fixed. Stability is something that continues to develop over time, and it depends on how the couple grows and develops themselves individually. And because of that, once that is ensured, once there is a stable physical system within the parents individually first, and then within the marriage itself, ensuring that the necessary nutrients are available and are present, ensuring that there is a continual, consistent supply of those nutrients so that the body develops well, ensuring that they are active, so they are not just sitting at home waiting for a child to be born. They engage in physical activity and physical exercises to adjust, to make the necessary adjustments, especially in the mother, for her to be able to give birth to this baby naturally with minimal complications. Nutrition is very important, and physical activity is also very critical so that the mother is able to give birth with minimal difficulty. So both of them will need to sit and plan and discuss this and decide what are the physical health requirements that are needed so that the child is born healthy. Of course, there is a need to disengage from unhealthy substances which may affect the health of the mother, and consequently they will affect the health of the child. We understand that the placenta is a protective shield for the child. However, there are certain chemical substances that once they enter into the bloodstream of the mother, they themselves seep in through the placenta and are perceived as a nutritional element needed for the child through the umbilical cord. It is important to keep against this, and that's why sometimes you hear doctors say avoid certain strong medications, avoid certain chemicals, avoid alcoholic beverages, avoid cigarette smoking. And when they are doing this, they are simply trying to ensure that the mother is healthy enough to give birth naturally. We very briefly mentioned on spiritual stability. Spiritual stability is basically looking at how is this person connected to a higher power? How are they connected to God in this case? What are elements of morality guiding their behavior? Morality and God are interconnected. So what elements of morality are guiding their behavior, their preparation, their aspirations? What virtues, what good deeds, or what good thoughts do they think about that they want to see being realized in their lives? Virtue is simply an aspiration of having goodness and good deeds being done in their lives. So virtue and morality are different. While morality seeks to protect against harm, virtue seeks to promote good. And all these things are tied to the supreme being, who is God. Having said that, I ask to pause here in this particular episode. Tune in the next one as we look further into the different stages of development. As couples, let's seek to grow together in these 4 dimensions, individually, then interdependently, mutually seek to develop this within ourselves so that we introduce a stable and a healthy environment for the child to come. Once again, this is Shem Kalafa for Shem Speaks, ShemK_Sai on TikTok. In case there are any comments that you have or any thoughts that you want to share concerning this discussion, feel free to write it in the comment section. See you in the next episode.